Yeah. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and apologies for the delay. Am I audible? Okay, all right.
Yes, Diksha.
Yes, Diksha.
Yeah, so welcome to the 29th installment of our monthly online guest lecture series organized by the research scholars at the School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, Goa University. The topic for today's lecture is Collectives with Intentions of Their Own, and we are honored to have Dr. Bhaskarjit Neog as our guide for this evening. Today's event is being recorded along with the contents in chat box. Kindly keep your microphones on mute throughout the lecture, which will unfold over approximately 60 minutes. After the lecture, we'll open the floor for questions. So jot down your queries so you won't miss the interactive segment. Now, without further ado, I invite Deepanki to deliver the welcome address.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Good afternoon, everyone. On the behalf of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, I welcome Dr. Bhaskarjit Neog, sir. Today, he will be delivering on the lecture Collectives with Intention of Their Own. So, Dr. Bhaskarjit Neog is an associate professor at the Center for Philosophy, JNU. He got a PhD from IIT Kanpur and did his MA from Utrecht University, the Netherlands, Linköping University, Sweden, and Guwahati University. Dr. Neuk received two prestigious international fellowships, the Endeavour Research Fellowships by the Government of Australia for pursuing postdoctoral research in the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University and Charles Sturt University, Australia, and the Erasmus Mundus Fellowship by the European Union for Research Masters. He has also been a visiting resident scholar at the Center for Human Values, Indian Institute of Management, Kolkata, IIM Kolkata, and UGC Inter-University Associate at his Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Simla. His primary research interests are social ontology, ethics, and moral and political philosophy. He has recently published a book titled What Responsibility? Whose Responsibility? From Roadless. He is presently a member of Ethics Committee of Sitaraman Bharatiya Institute of Science and Research, Delhi, and editorial board member of Journal of Human Values and Guwahati University Journal of Philosophy. I also extend my warm welcome to our Dean, Professor Dr. Professor Kosi Tharakan, and as well as all the faculties, research scholars, students, and all the participants. Thank you, sir, having with us. Over to you, Diksha. I welcome you again, sir.
Yeah, so you can please start your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all for joining this talk. Hope you are good and are comfortable in a comfortable position with your audio system. I had some difficulties, but I think now I am more or less all right. Thank you, Sia. Thank you to the entire team. I would also like to thank Professor Tarkan for this invitation. Good to be here speaking on this interesting platform which you have curated so well. I think this is first of its kind in philosophy in India, and I listened to some of the talks on your YouTube channel, and I found it really very interesting, and it's being done really well. So this talk is going to be in the intersection of two, or rather three areas of philosophy, namely philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, and social ontology. Most of you, I'm pretty sure, are familiar with the first two areas, and some of you would also know what social ontology is all about. But this talk is not going to be really on social ontology. I know Professor Tarakan wanted me to speak on social ontology, but I found it a bit challenging given the time limit that we have in this platform. But I assure you that you are going to hear a few things which are broadly are going to come under the category of social ontology. So I want to now share my slides. I have a very short slide, and let's see if that works. Uh, yeah, is this all right? Yeah. Is this visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Great.
Can you
yeah.
enlarge it a bit more, if possible?
There's a problem on the Chrome.
It's fine.
Sharing it through my Google Drive, so that's where the problem lies. But I think
it's fine. It's readable. Yeah.
Right. So this talk is in this talk, my main aim is to talk about the collectivist nature of collective intention, the intentional states which may be recognized as the underlying state of any genuine collective action and collective responsibility. So basically, I try to answer a bunch of questions which are interesting, not just from the point of view of philosophical deliberation, but also very intriguing from a common sense perspective. So looking at the composition of this forum, I'm going to give things simple and not really enter into the nitty-gritty of the philosophical debates that are taking place among the philosophers of collective intentionality at the moment. So my main aim here is to talk about, as I said, the collectivist nature of collective intention, and it's to talk about offer a non-individualist account of collective intention. And the account, I believe, is going to help us tremendously in understanding the problem of collective moral responsibility. So basically, this whole issue can be unpacked by paying attention to a bunch of interesting and intriguing questions. What is collective about collective intentions? Who could be owner or the author of such an intentional state? And how do they get formed? What roles do they have or do they play for the attribution of moral responsibility to collective entities? And most importantly, how do we articulate their presence or absence without being really verbose or flowery about that? So this is basically an attempt to answer some of these questions. I know it was not going to be a very sort of easy task, but I'll try. I'll try to do my best and see how we can respond to some of these questions. Yeah. In order to motivate you or to draw your attention to the whole phenomenon, let me begin by sort of telling you a very well documented anecdote. It's an anecdote that involves this philosopher called Elizabeth Anscombe, one of the most erudite analytic philosophers of the second half of the 20th century, and a very influential custodian of the philosophy of Wittgenstein. I think it was in 1958 summer, Anscombe led a very powerful protest against the administration of the Oxford University when Harry Truman was about to be awarded with an honorary degree by the university. Truman, as you know, had just finished his term as the president of the United States, and under whose role the USA actually bombed the two Japanese cities, as you know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and killing nearly 200,000 people. So Anscombe actually came out with a very interesting, and later it was actually published also, a pamphlet titled Mr. Truman's Degree. And there she argued that Truman was actually a killer who sort of intentionally kill thousands of people, innocent civilians. Surprisingly, this was not taken very sort of. It was administration didn't like it. Actually, there was a response from the highest body of the university. It's called Habdomadal Council, I think. So there's a representative who sort of firmly stood up and argued that Truman was not really the culprit. He didn't intentionally kill those innocent people. What he did is that he just merely put his signature on that special piece of paper that allowed those two bombs. But Anscombe actually found this whole response, the official response, very amusing, and at best very amusing, and at worst very deceitful, because it sort of overlooks the intentional action of Truman. And after this episode, actually, Anscombe took this whole matter, intention, action, and things related to that relationship very seriously, and wrote a monograph, and the title of that monograph is Intentions, which is now a classic in philosophy of action. So as I said, I talk about this anecdote just to invite you and to motivate you to in understanding the significance of this phenomenon called intentionality. Intentions, as you know, they're just one sort of attitude of a range of attitude that may be technically called intentionality. So the study of intentionality, interestingly, as you all know, has always been a favorite topic for philosophers. It took different shape and different size in different periods. I think it was Brandon who famously characterized intentionality as the mark of the mental. And Tim Crane also sort of subscribes to the same definition. And intentionality basically is all about our mental states. It's the mark of the mental. If that is the case, then there's something very interesting about collective intentionality. So if intentionality is the mark of the mental, obviously intentionality would invariably refer to the intentionality of the individual persons. And after all, it's the individual who has a mind or a brain of our own. And how can there be any intentionality without there being any mind? Now, groups or collectives, they do not have minds. So, that's a truism about groups. They do not have brains. Only their constituent members have, right? Now, given this conceptual sort of constraints, how do we talk about a minded matter, which is intentionality, in the context of a non-minded entity, which is collective, right? How do you talk about the mental matter in the context of an entity which apparently doesn't have a mind of its own? So that's the fundamental problem, right? So this whole phenomenon, because of this conceptual constraint, it apparently sort of looks very strange. It doesn't seem to make much sense. Although the whole idea of intentionality or collective intentionality as such is analytically, it sounds very sort of strange or counterintuitive. It's not something that is new, actually. In fact, the idea has been there in our philosophical literature for very early years. Many writers find actually similarities with Aristotle's concept of communion, or Russell's concept of general will, or for that matter, Durkheim's concept of collective consciousness. Now, I do not want to talk about the history behind this concept here, and I'm not an expert in the history of ideas. So here, basically, my aim is to sort of analytically dissect this whole concept and try to show how such an ambivalent concept can be made sense of without making things sort of metaphorical, as it were. So my main aim is to talk about the possibility of this concept from the point of view of philosophy of mind and philosophy of action, and also from social ontology. Yeah. So when you talk about collective intentions, there are three sort of views that might sort of draw your attention, and I want to sort of take up all these three views and then try to rebut each one of them, and so that none of this is going to be good enough. So the first view, which is based on our common sense understanding, collective intentions are, according to this view, just a figurative way of talking about the intentions of the individuals in the collective context. So according to this, when we say that Apple intends to launch a new product next week, or when we say that the government believes that it is gradually losing its popular support, we do not really mean that Apple, the company, really intends, or the government really believes that it is losing the popular support. No one might say here that this what we are doing here is that we are using this, we are ornamentally attributing these properties to these collective entities, because we cannot literally attribute intentional states to a government or a corporate entity. So we are basically using it as in an ornamental way. But this response, I think, doesn't hold much water, because when we attribute an intentional state or or a mental property like an intentional state, we do not use them really in a figurative way. Our statements bear, sort of some sort of special meaning or properties, as they do in the case of individuals. Besides, one might say, even if these attributions are ornamental, they do their job as we want them to do, as it were. So here one might argue that ornamentality doesn't really mean redundancy. We use them in an appropriate sense, even though these entities do not have a mind of their own. So this first commonsensical view doesn't really help much. Now the second interesting commonsensical suggestion is that collective intentions are just a collection of individual intentions. That's something very popular, because it's just a collection of individual intentions. It is effectively the intentional states of the majority of the individuals. So when all or most members intend to do, let's say, X, we call their individual intentions collective intention of doing X, and this view may be roughly called a majoritarian view, or in a technical sense. But again, this formulation is also not really free from flaws, because there are many situations where majority or all or most members of Z, let's say Z stands for group here, view that X, yet it doesn't really amount to X, that X is the view of G. So to give you a concrete example, suppose the Indian Parliament, suppose every member of the Indian Parliament individually believes that the judgment passed by the Supreme Court on the decriminalization of consensual sex among the same-sex persons is a bad judgment. But this doesn't really sort of amount to say that this was the view of the Indian Parliament, because Indian Parliament doesn't really subscribe doesn't really subscribe to that view, even though each and every individual parliamentarian has that belief. So again, that view also doesn't really help. Now, the third view, which is again very interesting, it says that collective intentions are basically it's a result of the mutual promise or mutual agreement between the constituent members. So this basically suggests that when two or more people, if a group could be constituted of two sort of individuals, so it suggests that when two or more people arrive at a collective intentional state, or when they declare that they have a particular intentional state which can be called collective, then they are basically tied up with some sort of explicit mutual promise between them. Now, so here in this view, collective intentions are basically dependent on the mutual promise that the individual members make. But this view again, which is slightly better than the first two, doesn't sustain. If the parties involved in the mutual sort of promise, if they are not sincere with their promise, that will not really lead to any collective intentional state or a successful collective intentional state, or there's not going to be any collective action proper. So that's one response. So the second response to this commonsensical view is that there could be collective intentional states without there being any mutual promise, or without there being any sort of linguistic expression or any exchange of words. So there's a very interesting example, and this probably would help us understand why this view really doesn't help or doesn't really sustain. So this is an example that I take from David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature. There's a chapter on convention. So there, Hume talks about two individuals. Of course, he didn't really, sort of elaborate on that. But it's a case of two individuals who find themselves on the bank of a river, and it is getting dark, and then don't know each other. They just happen to be there at that time, and from their appearances, they sort of figure out that they both want to cross the river. There's a river, and they want to cross the river, and unfortunately, there isn't anything on the bank of the river which they could use for sort of crossing the river. So, but interestingly, they came across a piece of wood, and they started sort of using that wood to cross the river, and there was really no sort of promise being made by these two individuals, and there's no exchange of words. They sat on two sides of the piece of wood, and then they started rowing, and then effectively they were able to perform that joint action, and then they successfully crossed the river. So here's a case that suggests that there could be effective collective action, there could be a joint action without there being any mutual promise, or without there being any language. So even language is also not really required for the formation of collective intentionality. So this is how we can sort of critically analyze some of these commonsensical views in order to show that these commonsensical views are sort of abysmally fall short of figuring out the essence of collective intentions. Now, how do you then go about articulating a philosophically sophisticated account of collective intention? I think the best way to sort of proceed further is to sort of talk about the location of collective intentions, and by locations I mean the sites where collective intentionality takes place, right? So sort of and there could be two here. I'm suggesting that there could be two possible locations or two possible sites of collective intentions. As I said, collective intentions are just one attitude of collective intentionality. Collective intentionality might refer to a bunch of intentional attitudes, including belief, desire, willing, wishing, or you name it, all of them in the context of a collective. Now, there could be two sort of locations or two sides that we could think about, roughly speaking. The first is what I call group mind, and the second one is coercive mind. So let's first talk about group mind. Is group mind an appropriate candidate as a site of collective intention? Now, group mind is a very interesting idea. It's there, very much there in our popular science fiction, but it's also there in history of philosophy. If you look at the history of philosophy, you will come across this idea in different forms. Now, in popular science, you have this idea called hive minds. The thought is that all is one and one is all. So in the history of philosophy, there are multiple concepts, as I said, that are similar to the idea of group mind. As I said, the Durkheim's concept of collective consciousness, or Hegel's, the famous concept Christ, are two sort of prominent thoughts or two prominent concepts that come quite close to this idea or the thought of group mind. So the group mind is not really a sum of or the aggregation of individual minds. Rather, it is sort of a mind of its own, and with a very separate level of rationale, with a very separate level of emotional or intentional capacity. So it's a mind. We could say it's a mind that could hover over and above the individual minds. So it's the bigger and better mind that takes control over all the individuals that are out there within that collective. Now, it's a very interesting and intriguing idea, but then it is not really going to be very helpful for us in understanding the possibility of collective intentions. Now, one of the corollaries of a group mind thesis is that the individual minds or individual selves will have no sort of independent locus standi, as it were. They're going to be just the cog in the machine. And so individual members or individual constituent members will lose their intentional autonomy, as it were. So the group, in the absence of their intentional autonomy, the group, the bigger and the better mind that exists over the individual minds, that will actually gradually develop its own agency, and eventually it will become an autonomous entity. Now, the acquired consciousness of that kind of group would then sort of replace the consciousness of all the constituent members. Now, this is something very interesting, but at the same time, it's very dangerous because it has certain implications. And the first implication is that the individual members are not going to have any autonomous, existence, and it is sort of fraught with multiple sort of problematic, issues. How can there be, one might say, how can there be a fusion of minds? So a one single mind sort of made up of many minds, as it were. How do individual minds come together to form a powerful mind in any meaningful sense? So it is both conceptually and practically sort of impossible to have such a grand entity in the strict sense of the term. It doesn't have real world existence. You can just imagine such a possibility, but conceptually it is not a consistent sort of idea. Now, and that's not really going to help us understand the possibility of collective intentionality, because when you talk about collective intentionality, each and every individual member ought not to have its intentional autonomy. Now, I'm going to elaborate on that, but there's something called coercive mind, which is the second option that you can think of as an alternative site of collective intention. So this idea, which I call coercive mind is in some sense, it's very different from group mind, but also it has a lot of similarities with group mind thesis because of its singularity claim. So the easiest way to understand this idea is to sort of think about an autocratic king, an authoritative leader, or a super powerful dictator. The coercive mind is a mind that sort of coerces all the individuals in order to make them, subservient under its fold. It's a mind that sort of overpowers others and takes control of their presence and their authenticity. The same thing happens in the case of group mind, but here it is more real and it is more sort of practically sort of viable. Think about an autocratic king. Whatever he does, it becomes the deed of the state. It becomes the action of the population that he leads. But these two ideas, these two theses, actually, they sort of distort the whole idea of collective, the whole idea of collectivity in our explanation. It cannot really sort of represent multiple views. There are two sort of important aspects that are not that are going to be that are going to be contested, that are going to be be having issues, because first is that the intentional autonomy of the individual. That's the first issue that is going to be undermined. That the intentional autonomy of individual members will not be retained if you accept the possibility of group mind thesis. The second important issue is the feature of plurality of the involving agents. The plurality is a very, very core aspect of an idea of collective. Without there being any plurality, you cannot really talk about any collective identity. You cannot really talk about any collectivity. So both these aspects are going to be hugely undermined if we accept any of these two theses. Now then, how do you then sort of go about it, right? So there are three things that sort of come out from this critical analysis. The first thing is that action can be made sense of only in terms of intentional states of individuals, right? Intentions are paradigmatically located in the minds or brains of individual human persons. So no action without intention. That's another important aspect that needs to be taken into account, because actions without intentions really don't make much sense, because it is the intention that gives the actual sort of identity of an action. Otherwise, every happenstance or every occurrence is an event. So the difference between action and an event is the presence of an intentional state. So that's the first thing. The second important thing is that no individual mind is capable of representing the intentional state of many individuals, right? So intentions are, by nature, very rational in nature. I cannot really intend on others' behalf, right? So when the king decides to do something on behalf of the state, the king really cannot or doesn't intend, in the literal sense of the term, doesn't really intend on behalf of the population, on behalf of the people that he represents, right? So he can have a desire on somebody's behalf, but he cannot really intend on somebody's behalf. Intention is a matter of possibility or impossibility. If there is if there is intentions, it talks about the possibility of doing, possibility of there being an action. The third important thing is that no group mind could sort of ever sort of represent the interest of a collection of people in the strict sense of the term, because the main problem here is the intentional autonomy of those individuals. Each individual member's intentionality has to be respected, has to be taken care of, has to be taken into account if you are going to talk about plurality. Now, how do you then talk about the possibility of collective intentions if collective intentions are not going to be had by the individual human persons? So the best, the most interesting way is that you have to sort of come down to the individual minds. And this is what I call the third sort of location, the third alternative that you can think of. Well, group mind doesn't help. Coercive mind doesn't really hold any promise. So what is left? It's the individual mind, right? So the best way is to talk about this mind that matter, namely the intentionality of a collective entity, in terms of the mindedness of the constituent individual members. So this is actually the path that has been taken up by many philosophers in recent times. So basically, two things have to be taken care of. First, that the multiplicity of individual participation in the making of that state of affairs, which you call the collective intentional states, and then the interrelationality or intertwinement of the intentional participation of all or most members for the development of a singular perspective. So in a way, collective intentions refer to a phenomenon which is single, but it's not singular because it involves plurality of individual participation. So these two sort of features have to be kept in mind when you float an account of collective intentionality. Okay. Is this going all right?
Yes, I'm fine.
Thanks. So now I'm going to talk about two major approaches, and these approaches, and I claim that can be seen in the works of four major philosophers. These are the philosophers, and I'm going to talk about these two approaches, how these two approaches are sort of in a mixed way are finding their grip in their articulation. First is individuals as a group, which I call the individualist path of understanding collective intentions. The second is the non-individualist path, which is a group of taking the entire phenomenon as a matter of a group of individuals. So let's see how these two approaches are sort of are finding their place in the accounts of these four major thinkers: Michael Bratman, John Searle, Raimo Tuomela, Margaret Gilbert. Of course, they sort of they are working in different areas, and they are writing on different sorts of stuff in philosophy of action and philosophy of mind. But also in their writings, for instance, Gilbert has this very interesting book published in 1989 called On Social Facts. She's a Durkheimian, but she has a very interesting take on collective intentions. If you go through the book, you will get a very sort of a solid account of collective intentions. Similarly, there's this philosopher, a Finnish philosopher called Raimo Tuomela, has been writing on these things for quite some time now. John Searle, interestingly, wrote just one paper in 1990 called Collective Actions and Collective Intentions. And it was, I think, it was a part of a very obscure anthology. Initially, nobody paid any attention to that, but later on, when he came up with this book called Construction of Social Reality, that made a huge noise about this whole thesis. So he also has a very solid stand on collective intentions. And Michael Bratman, philosopher from Stanford, has been writing on these issues, on what he calls, he doesn't use the term collective intentions. They have their own terminology, interestingly. Bratman uses this terminology called shared intentions. For him, collective intentions are a state of affairs and they are reductive in nature. Collective intentions have to be understood in a reductive way, and for him, formation of collective intention doesn't really demand any entity over and above the individual intentions and their interrelations. So he's a very strong supporter of this doctrinal position called methodological individualism. Methodological individualism is a very interesting thesis in social ontology. So he's a very strict individualist in his approach, and but interestingly for him, collective intentions or shared intentions are not really there in the minds of individuals. They are, according to him, the complexes of appropriately constrained individual intentions and their interrelations understood in an appropriate way. So the individual relevant interdependent intentions together form a peculiar wave, and that wave is called collective intentions. So there's a formulation which may be roughly called like I intend that we J. That I intend that we J. That's a very interesting formulation. Like when you say I intend to go to the department, or I intend to do a good presentation. This is something that I can do. But when I say we intend to do something, we intend to go for tea together, this is something that is not really, when you utter this expression, that intentional ability is your individual ability. But involving insofar as agents are concerned, so far as the action of going for the tea is concerned, that's a matter of two individuals. So how can you intend on somebody else's behalf? So intention is something which is a very rational concept, and that's why this is a very interesting analysis. I can fly like a bird, but I cannot form an intention to fly like a bird. So intention is a particular state of mental state that has that rationality in its nature. So, but that's why Bratman doesn't really talk about collective intentions as a matter of mental state. Rather, he talks about it as a state of affairs. But then individuals are interrelated in a particular way. And the content of that intention is also very, very interesting. It's like we J kind of thing. I intend that we go to the dinner together. It's like that. So that's the formulation. The Searle, interestingly, offers another very interesting account. And for him, all the intentions, whether individual or collective or shared, whatever you call them, has to be there in the minds of the participant, has to be there in the minds of individuals. Contrary to Bratman, he thinks that we intentions, which is an expression of collective intention, cannot be really reduced to I intentions. So, but he doesn't really deny the reverse of the claim when you say that is how I intentions form we intentions. So basically, he thinks that we intentions can be had by individuals together with other similar intentional attitudes, involving other individuals. So human beings, according to him, have this unique capacity to form collective intentional states. And this capacity for him is biologically innate. It's a very interesting formulation. So if you think that Brackman is an individualist, but his kind of individualism is of a very formal nature. So his individualism can be called a formal individualism, whereas Searle's individualism is of a very subjective kind. It's a subjective individual. So he's a thoroughgoing sort of Cartesian in that sense, because he thinks that intentions have to be there in the minds of the individuals. Collective intentions, definitely the location of collective intentions has to be appropriately there in the minds of the individuals and nowhere else. Tuomela, on the other hand, the third important theorist that I am taking up here is making a distinction between I mode and we mode of intentional states. So we mode it's about the mode that we have when you hold a particular intentional state. So I mode of holding an intentional attitude it means that having it at the personal level. I intend to finish this presentation in another, let's say, in 20 minutes. Or when I say I intend to go for a cup of tea, so the mode that I have is an individual mode, or the I mode, and that's for my individual action or my individual intention. Whereas the we mode of holding an attitude means having the attitude as a member of a group or a member of a collective, right? So when I say let's do this together, I'm expressing my intention, but I'm expressing my intention as a part of the collective. I am expressing that intentional attitude as a part of that group, the group that intends to do this or do that. So that's again a very interesting formulation from Tuomela. Margaret Gilbert, who has a very interesting take on this, quite different from the first three thinkers. For her, it's the plural subject. Collective intentions are a matter of plural subject, and collective intentions can be attributed to something called plural subject. When two people, there's a very interesting paper called Walking Together by Gilbert. So in that paper, she gives an example of walking together, the mundane exercise of walking together. When I and my spouse, we go for a walk together. When I say, let's go for a walk, and she agrees on that, and then we go for a walk together. So by agreeing to go for a walk together, we form a collective subject, as it were. And that subject is over and above the individuals. That is to say, me and my spouse, my wife. She is not the owner of that intentional state. I am also not the owner of that intentional state. Rather, it's the collective subject that is formed by me and the other person, and that subject is the owner of that intentional state, namely, let's go for a walk together. So there's a very interesting concept called joint sort of commitment. So when two people sort of form a joint commitment to do something together, they form a collective intentional state. Right, and that collective intentional state can be attributed to that body or to that whole, which is the plural subject. Now, all these accounts are very interesting, very intriguing. They motivated the whole generation of people in social ontology to think about these things and to find flaws in their accounts interesting. That's the most interesting thing. So a lot of writings have taken place in last 15, 20 years. So these accounts, in my mind, they're not really free from flaws. So here's what I think about these accounts and how I give a better twist or account of their understanding of collective intentionality and the additional things that I have to say about that. So Bradman is right in my understanding, in my analysis. He's quite right in emphasizing the content of we intention. So there are three things that can be talked about: the mode, content, and subject. Right? The collective, the idea of the collectivity can be understood as a matter of a subject. It can be understood as a matter of the content of intentional state, that is to say, collective intentional state, and it could also be understood in terms of the mood that you have when you hold a particular collective intentional state. So Bradman is quite right in emphasizing the content. He's right that we intentions or collective intentions are the result of a special combination of I intentions with a very special content. But he's quite, I think he's not really uh, entirely correct in sort of taking things in the reductive spirit in reductive terms. He's reducing this whole phenomenon of we intentions to I intention, and that's where the problem lies. Searle definitely is a better proposal, but then the problem with Searle is that the subjectivity. If you follow Searle's strategy, then you can attribute an intentional state to, let's say, somebody called Robinson Crusoe, who is out there in an island, isolated place. Nobody is out there, so you can hold a collective intentional. You can think of a collective intentional states in terms of that kind of agency, a loner, because Robinson Crusoe can have the illusion of there being other people, other individual members around him, and he can form that intentional state of his own. But is this the is this the solution? Does it really lead to any collective action situation? Definitely not. Even though the state can be very much present in the mind of Robinson Crusoe, but that state cannot really drive him all the way to a collective action proper. And that's where the problem lies with Searle, in my understanding. Turmel, on the other hand, is quite correct in saying and suggesting that it's a matter of joint intentions, but then he also suffers from reductivism, because he also, like Bradman, sort of reduces things to intentional states of the individual members. Gilbert, on the other hand, looks pretty sort of promising. Her account of plural subject is tremendously helpful, but then this entity called plural subject is somewhat coming perilously closer to the idea of group mind. The moment you accept such an entity, there's always a fear that the constituent individual members are going to be losing their intentional autonomy. And this is the first concern, or the second, it's the first concern that I had when I was raising the objection. I was raising objection against group mind or coercive mind, because you cannot really imagine a third entity over and above the two constituent individuals involved in a collective action situation. Really not possible. It sounds good, but it really, scientifically speaking, really doesn't make sense to think about the third entity. It's only you and me, and this is something that's going to be going to be interestingly illustrated in the video that I'm going to play towards the end of this presentation. So, I'm all right with Gilbert, but then I have some reservations. But then, how do I sort of articulate my own, what I call, non-individualist position? So the idea main here is how to sort of explain, how to sort of capture the feature of plurality of individuals, and at the same time the singularity of the perspective that emerges from the formation of collective intentions. So these are the two sort of defining features that have to be kept in mind, whether you are an individualist or a non-individualist or a collectivist like Gilbert. These two things have to be kept in mind. So with that sort of assumption, I have a few things to talk about. So if individuality is the defining feature of an individual entity, which is what we say all the time when we talk about individual human persons, that each and every individual has has their own individuality. So if individuality is the defining feature or defining character of an individual entity for retaining its identity as an autonomous entity, then the character that defines a collective entity is its collectivity, right? The collectivity is the defining feature of a collectivity, if individuality is the defining feature of an individual person. Now, after all that is, that it is the collectivity separates, in a way, separates a collective entity from its individual members and their collections. So any intentional state attributable to a collective entity sort of in a way must depict this character of collectivity. Collectivity has to be figured in. And I'm not saying that these theories are sort of neglecting this whole phenomenon of collectivity, but they are not able to really give a proper location to this collectivity in their explanation of collective intentionality. And that's where the problem lies. So most of these accounts, to my mind, are sort of fraught with this challenge of depicting the collective, depicting this character within the framework of their sort of individualism. All of them are individualist, except Gilbert. All three are sort of thorough individualists. So I think it's the Cartesian legacy that borders them in keeping the individual's mind as the main sort of architect of architect for the formation of collective intentionality. Of course, no doubt, collective individuals are very much a part of that explanation. But how do you sort of overcome the constraint of their subjectivity? That's the challenge, and that has to be fixed, to my mind. But so how does this phenomenon of collectivity come into the picture? So this collectivity may be called, group-mindedness, or the group rationality, group point of view, or spirit de corps, or a point of view from the group, as it were, involving the multiplicity character. So I think a comprehensive account of collective intentionality must sort of individuate this collectivity in a way that will sort of, in a way, take care of the autonomy of the individual members, and this collectivity, I think, needs to be understood in terms of normativity. The normativity has to be there when you talk about the interpersonal relationship. Normativity does come into the picture, even though we don't really find its necessity, as Bretman finds, or Searle, for that matter, makes it exclusively clear that no, there's no chance of any normativity. It's just a matter of interpersonal interconnectivity or relationality that does the job. I think normativity does have a role to play, but then this normativity needs to be sort of understood or articulated very carefully. The norms that are involved have to be some sort of a softer norm, as it were, reliance, for instance, or mutual expectations, mutual belief, trust, so on and so forth. So there's a very interesting case, that comes to my mind. It's a case, and that actually, in a way, suggests the nature of this normativity. Are you really talking about moral normativity here? No, I don't think so. So this case is from, there's this famous TV sort of series called The Money Heist. So there you have this professor, and then there's a bunch of individuals who are always ready to assist the professor to go for robbing a bank. So if you look at their relationships, it's a gang, right? They all know that what they do is definitely morally not acceptable, but then they have certain obligation to each other, as it were. When the doctor, as a leader of the gang, says something, Berlin, or for that matter Helsinki, they have to come together. They have to accept that proposal and then act upon that. So there is a matter of sort of a normative relationship, even though the group itself is not based on any moral norms. So whenever we form a group, whenever we form a sort of uh, a whole, this interpersonal relationship has to be or needs to be understood in terms of some sort of normative ground, normative base. And this is what it suggests. And that normativity is not really a moral normativity, right? So when you talk about the collectivity, it basically tells us about the commanding power of the collectivity, and that is collective agency, the agency that gets formed in that interconnectedness. So, but then there is a very interesting sort of difference with individual intentions and individual actions, individual intention and individual agency. When you talk about individual intentions, there's individual agency. But when you talk about collective intentions, in my understanding, collective agency issue does come into the picture, but there's a difference between the individual case and the collective case. So the difference is this: in the case of individual intention and individual agency, the agency is sort of logically prior to intention, right? There's an agency already out there, as it were. The individual agent, in a way, pre-exists the individual intention. It's the individual agent that intends to do X or Y, right? But in the case of collective, there's no pre-existing agency, as it were, right? Instead, the collective agency is actually the result of the formation of collective intention, right? When the participating individuals form a collective intentional state of doing something, and that sort of constitution, ipso facto, gives rise to this phenomenon called collective agency. So in this presentation, I'm not really going to talk about the possibility of collective agency, its conditions, and other things. My focus is basically collective intentions. So this, intentions, on this account, collective intentions can be sort of understood as the intentions of a collective in the strict sense of the term, because it's not left with the individual members alone, but it's something that comes out of that interpersonal relationship, and that collectivity is, in a way, the point of view or the rational point of view, as Carol Rovain would suggest. It's something that that can be considered as the agent of that collective intentionality, agent of that action that is performed with that intentional state. So if this intention can be taken as the underlying intentional state for a collective action, then the action performed by the collective can be brought under the framework of moral assessment. So moral responsibility can be attributed to those collective actions which are grounded in some sort of collective intentions. So without intentions, there's no genuine collective action, and thus there's no question of collective responsibility. Now, I want to is Sia out there? May I ask you to sort of play that video that I have, because that sort of gives us the real picture of what I'm suggesting here.
We strolled the Spanish marketplace at 90 in the shade, with all the fruit and vegetables so temptingly arrayed. And that we can share a memory as every lover must. And I remember oranges, I remember oranges, I remember oranges, and you remember dust. The autumn leaves are tumbling down and winter's almost here. But through the spring and summertime we laughed away the year. And now we can be grateful for the gift of memory. For I remember having fun, two happy hearts that beat as one. When I had thought that we were we, but we were you and me.
Yeah, basically, this is what I wanted to know. Two happy hearts beat as well. When I had thought that we were you and me. Thank you. Thanks for that. It's helpful.
Thank you, sir, for such insightful lecture. Now I invite Aruvi to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Diksha. Just a note before the Q&A, participants may either address their questions directly to the speaker by using the raise hand option at the bottom of the screen, or you could also choose to type in your questions in the chat box and we'll be happy to read it out on your behalf. The floor is now open for Q&A.
As maybe, yeah, Sia has a question. Okay, Sia, please.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation. My question is that I feel at some level it's not possible to exactly grasp the intention of the other, or I don't know whether a complete, uh, I don't know whether we can reach a state where the we is ever possible in that sense. But do you think it's possible that it depends on the goal that the two are trying to achieve, or a group that they're trying to achieve? If the goal seems to be somewhat similar, I think they may align themselves as the we, and then if the goal no longer matches, then I think it just remains the you and the me. Would you say something on this?
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks. That is interesting. That's a very good question. Yes. If you are a thorough subjectivist, definitely won't see any reason to believe that you have that access to the other person's intentional state. That's true, and that is, to a great extent, that is actually true. But then we do sort of form certain state that sort of takes care of certain states of affairs, right? We do perform, joint actions. And for that, I think you were right in saying that it's the goal that motivates both of us. And that goal, in a way, gives us the reason to form an intention in such a way that the other party is also going to be aligning with me, and accordingly we'll be able to perform that action together in order to reach that point. So a thorough individualist definitely is going to take that path. For people like this writer, philosopher called Seamus Miller, he doesn't have an account of collective intention in this strict sense. It doesn't float it as an independent account, but he talks about this often when he talks about collective actions as basically a matter of joint action. There's nothing called collective in the strict sense of the term. It's just a figurative way of talking about the combination of individual participation. So it's the goal, it's the common point that motivates us to do things in such a way that we'll see a reason to align ourselves, do the adjustment wherever it is required, and then take us forward, as it were. You just don't just think about your own self or your own action, but also you have an eye on the other's performance in that sense. So it's a kind of a bargaining that takes place between you and me, and that bargaining is necessary for the achievement of that collective goal or the point or the destination. Yes, you are right in saying that it's all about that. There's no access to the individual intentions in the strict sense of the term. If you follow the strict individualist path, that's the answer that you get. But I think that answer is, although quite consistent, and the path is quite logically sort of coherent. I think there are occasions where we do need to see why we ought to go beyond that. We need to go beyond that point of being thoroughly individualistic and say something about the collective state of affairs. That's exactly the point that I was trying to make when I gave the example of the Indian Parliament, right? So even if the individual members do not have that intentions at their individual level, yet when they sit together at a particular platform, they do see it as they do see the point that they should raise their hand and say that yes, we agree, even though at the personal level, at the private level, they may not like it, right? And that's the agreement that we are talking about. It's the we attitude, and that we attitude is indeed shared attitude. I hope that answers your questions. Does that answer your question, Shia? She had more questions.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir, that does. But this is exactly what I was trying to say, that I will let go of my individual interest at some level only if my larger goal aligns with that of the group.
True, true,
So
true.
that was the point
Yeah.
that I was trying to
Yeah.
make. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Professor Koshi, you may ask the question.
Thanks, Professor Bhaskarjit. It was a very interesting presentation. So if I understood you correctly, you were making this proposal that, I understand that you are trying to bring both, the notion of the subject and the content, addressing both. And I understand your proposal as, giving recognition of the logical priority of the, agent, the agency as logical prior to intention. So you are starting from an individual agent through his intention, but then how do you move to the collective, agency? That individual intention somehow invite that collective agency, isn't it? Then only you can arrive at a collective, intentionality. So moving from individual agency to individual intentions to collective agency, that jump I am not very clear. From
Right.
individual intention to collective agency, how do you bring that?
Thanks. So I think towards the end, I made this point. The main point is this. So there are two cases. One is the individual case, and the other is the collective case. At the individual level, I have my individual intentions, I have my individual action, and then individual responsibility, right? So the relationship between individual agency and the individual intention is of a very particular kind, where the agency in a way predates the intention. So the agent is already out there to intend to do something on their own, as it were. But that's precisely not the case in the case of collective intentionality. So there is no collective agent, as it were. There's no agential status that exists out there, right? When the individual members come together and they share their opinion or beliefs, and then they form a particular state or a particular proposition that this is the statement of our group. This is what we want to subscribe to, and this is our official statement. So they agree, right? And that at times aligns with what you believe at the individual level, and at times it doesn't really align with it. But for the sake of the other, for the sake of the group, you do agree that yes, this needs to be sort of accepted at the group level, even though I don't really agree or I do not really like it. So that sort of that point when that the point of convergence happens, that's where that agential point of view emerges. So in that sense, unlike the individual case, in the case of collective, the agency comes after the formation of the intentional state, which is shared between these individual members, right? So the agency is not really logically prior. That's the point that I was trying to make, actually. So we see a difference. Although all the way we have been trying to sort of give a sort of picture in line with the individual case. If there is individual intention, there is individual action, then there's agency, the equation of responsibility can be talked about, so on and so forth. So the same picture is being sort of is being borrowed and then placed it in the context of a collective. And then there we are trying to see what's the intentional state, who is the collective, who is the author of this intentional state, who is the agent, and who should bear the burden of moral responsibility, right? So that's the point that I was trying to make. And even though we do see this sort of mimicking of the individual case, there is a sort of point where things are sort of a bit different from the individual case. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think there is a follow-up from Sia regarding the last statement. She asks if the collective comes into being only when I let go of the individual for the sake of the collective.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no. So let's say, let's take the Gilbertian example of walking together. When I say, hey, Sia, let's go for a walk together, and you say, yes, you agree. So we form the collective. We form a non-individual entity, and that entity performs the job of going for a walk together, right? So in between, suppose after walking half a mile, you say, no, I'm going to go home. I'm not going to go with you, and I'm tired, and so on and so forth. That may be quite all right. That I might take that as okay, fine. But if after a point, just after agreeing upon, if you change your mind, I'll see something going wrong there in that sociality that we have sort of formed there. Right? You can't just say no to it. You can't change your mind so easily without really sort of asking my opinion about it. Right? You cannot rescind that commitment, as it were, so quickly, unless there is there's a good reason for you to do that, right? So even though it's always not a matter of sacrifice, it's not really a matter of surrendering yourself to the other. There is a sort of reasonable amount of sort of constraint that you feel, or that you have, or you find meaning in being there with that constraint. Our sociality is all about that constraint, isn't it? Sociality probably wouldn't come into the picture if there is no constraint on my individual self, right? So that constraint is important. If we don't, follow that constraint, or if you don't really respect that constraint, you'll be living in an anarchic world, I think. And the sociality would just not be possible in that sense. So there's always a it's a matter of sort of giving and and sort of taking, as it were. It's a kind of a mutual adjustment. That's where the sociality emerges. In a paradigmatic case, of course. That's an ideal picture that I'm talking about. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but that's the ideal picture of the sociality that you can talk about. And that's...
Yes, sir, got it.
Hello.
Yeah, before we go to the follow-up from Shreya, we'll take Muhammad Ali's question. So you may please unmute.
Hello.
Yes.
My question is about the priority you give it to intention in the case of collective agency. In the case of the formulation of collective agency, you are responding to Koshi's question. At that time, you mentioned that.
Yes.
But I still feel there is a problem there. The problem is this: you have to take a decision to be in agreement with the other, to have the same intentionality. In your agency matters there. If you don't take the decision to be in agreement with the other, to have the same intentionality, it will not take place. You have to take a decision. Hello? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Some network problem here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying, then that questions your point that in the case of collective intentionality, what in the case of the relation between collective intentionality and collective agency, collective intentionality comes first, agency comes later. But yes, at one point you are right, I agree. When it reaches that level, you are right. But prior to that, there is an individual's decision to reach that point.
Right.
So how do you address that?
Yeah. No, the agency that I'm talking about here is the collective agency. Of course, individual agency is never neglected. Individual presence of the individual agency is very much a part of the entire explanation. You cannot really have any explanation without taking into consideration the contributions coming from the individual agents. After all, a collective is all about individuals and their particular way of having a particular special relationship with each other. So individual agency is never neglected, and at the same time, it is also not given any primacy. Of course, here we are talking about collective state of affairs. So the moment we give, suppose the proposal comes from one of us, let's say the proposal of going for a walk together coming from you, well, that doesn't mean that you own that sort of proposal, right? It's a proposal that is being adopted by the entire collective, as it were. So it's a proposal of the group. The moment everybody agrees upon it has to come from somebody. That's true. And it could also be the case that at times 2-3 people see something together at the same time. It's just that one person articulates it in a particular way, and the other, the rest of the people just, they just see a reason to agree upon it because the same thing or thought must be going on in their mind. So when they see that this is exactly what I was thinking about, then they see a reason to say, yes, I'm game. So that's what I'm trying to say. So the individual agency is never neglected, but at the same time, it is not given any primacy or sort of any upper hand over any other agency, right? That's exactly the case. That is exactly the point that is made in the case of coercive action or coercive mind. That's what happens. The individual agency takes over the agency of the rest of the individuals, and whatever that individual agent thinks, he makes it clear to the rest of the individuals that has to be the official view of them. But that's not a typical collective action case. It's just a bad, that's not an ideal case, right? That's just an individual case taking an ugly turn, and then we are calling it a collective state of affair. But it's not a really collective state of affair. It's just a coercive action. Yeah, I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
There is a follow-up comment from Sia. I'll just read it out. I was talking more in the sense of aiming for the same goal, but for different reasons. Like going to the beach might make two people feel completely different. We do not know the intentions of both, but we know perhaps that it would make both feel pleasant and they decide to go to the beach. This would still be collective.
Yes. So, working on Sia, I'm quite intrigued by your questions. All the questions are very impressive. This particular question, aiming for the same goal but with different reasons, that is actually a very interesting sort of point. Yes, it might happen. Sort of, yeah. I think you have given a good example. Like going to the beach might make two people feel completely different. Yes, we do not know the intention of both. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I agree entirely. Yeah, it could be the case that there are two different people have two different reasons, but then both the reasons are sort of meet at a point where their interest gets satisfied. I know it's a kind of you can call it an accidental case. Well, it's not an accidental case. It happens most of the time. Suppose you think think about a bill that is being tabled in the parliament. One party votes it because it really sincerely believes that it ought to be passed. The other party, suppose, votes for it, thinking that it is going to this step is going to show their anti-establishment sort of take, or somebody else will vote in order to help the winning party win convincingly. Different sort of parties may have different reasons to vote for the same premise. Yes, that's true. I mean, that's what happens, when in climate change, sort of forums, when different countries meet and they have different reasons, and they, at the international level, international relations, this is exactly what happens. Sometimes you vote because you want to make a point. Sometimes you want to vote because you want to upset your opponent, right? So there are different reasons. Yes, yeah, and yet it could be a collective case. That's a very good point. Yes, I like it. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. I had a question. How does the idea of moral responsibility pan out in terms of collective intentionality?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry that I didn't have enough time to talk about collective responsibility, although I wrote a book on collective responsibility. But this particular thesis doesn't really take care of all the cases of collective responsibility. It takes care of a particular kind of collective, namely the corporate entities, or corporate or the collective entities that have a structure of their own, that can be said to have a decision procedure. Think about a committee or an organization that has its own structure, that has its own decision procedure, that has its own sort of method of arriving at a particular conclusion, right? So in those cases, this kind of account of collective intentionality will work, but not with all kinds of collective responsibility cases, because collective responsibility is a very broad sort of issue. There you have shared responsibility. You have, there are cases of collective responsibility where intentionality doesn't come into the picture, right? When you talk about the responsibility of this present generation for the pollution that we are creating on this planet, there's no intentionality involved. Nobody really intends to pollute the planet, but yet we end up doing the same thing. So probably the thesis on intentionality is not going to really sort out that kind of problem of collective responsibility. So there are different kinds of collective responsibility cases depending upon the kind of collective that you are concerned about, that you are talking about. It could be a committee, it could be a mob. A mob is also a collective, right? But mob is not a structured entity. It doesn't have its own identity, right? It could be just a bunch of people coming together and doing things as they feel that should be doing. Or a country or a state responsibility, right? Or when you talk about global population, humanity's responsibility, right? Or the responsibility of the global south, for instance, when you say talk about things like environmental issues. So depending upon the kind of collective that you have in mind, so the answer varies. So as I said, this account of collective intention doesn't really help us explain all kinds of collective responsibility cases. Only one particular kind of collective responsibility cases can be addressed through this, and that's what I can say at this moment.
Thank you, sir. And for the last question, Diksha, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Now, I have a question regarding the just war theory. So, within a nation at war, factions different factions like ethnic, political factions may have conflicting intentions. Now, how can these divergent collective intentions be accommodated in just war theory?
Just war theory. Well, just war theory is not just one theory. It basically refers to an area.
Yeah, because since we're talking about the responsibility, collective responsibility, so taking nation as the entity, as a collective.
Yeah. So your question is how to talk about the intention of different entities on a particular.
Yes, the divergent collective intentions, like ethnic factions or political ideological factions. Take, for example, the Syrian war. So different factions like the rebels or the Kurdish rebels, like that.
Right. I think that sort of answers the question, because there's a lack of collective intentionality proper. Of course, each collective can be said to have its own intentional state, right? I can think in terms of individuals rather than collectives. Each collective is also an individual at a different level, right? So it's most of the time we don't find ourselves in agreement. We don't see that this should be done, or this is how we should be sort of pursuing this or that. We don't find ourselves in agreement, and that's where the problem lies. It's all war is always a matter of conflict, right? There's no collective intention. If I understood your...
As in it goes separative, as in all the collectives, different collectives represented by different factions are taken as individual intentions that way?
Yeah. So different collective entities can be taken as different individuals, because that's the main point that I was trying to make, that there is a rational point of view, there is a singular point of view. Collective entity is a single entity, but it's not singular. It's plural. So there's something singular. There's some singleness about it. There has to be one proposition, one statement, one voice, right?
Okay.
And that could be coming from a group or an individual, or it could come from multiple groups or multiple individuals, depending upon the level that you are talking about. At the international level, at the global level, you are probably talking about collective entities, and they are acting as individuals. They represent different individual members, or they may not really represent anybody's view in particular. That's another very interesting theme, actually. Whether what these states represent, is it really a representation of our view in the strict sense of the term? I think that's a political philosophy problem. It may or may not. Most of the time, it doesn't really. So state responsibility doesn't really represent the responsibility of its individual members. Most of the time, the statements made by different states or countries, we don't really believe that this is exactly the average American thing. So this is exactly the statement coming from an average individual, Indian person, right? You can probably say it in some sense, and because there is nothing called average Indian or average American, but that's how it is to be articulated, I guess.
Just a follow-up. So in this case, can we take it as as in one of your slides, the majority of members? So can this faction or the different factions be taken with respect to the majority? I mean, the ones which are representing the majority, as in the populist view, if that functions.
Yeah, I haven't really studied this whole majority phenomenon. It has a very different understanding. I think if you're interested, please read up Philip Petit's take on this whole idea of majority in this context. The majority, yes, but more than the majority, it's the now let's say it's a majority voice. It's the voice of the majority of people. It may not really be the voice of each and every one, or 80%. If there's a collective of 100 people, it's the voice of 80 individuals. In a majority, the idea of majority may not really be understood in terms of numbers as such. They also interpret as a as something which perhaps they would agree upon, right? In a very tentative way, you can take it. That this probably the view that they will not mind having it, right? Or it's somewhat in spirit, if not in later. In spirit, that's the view of the majority, and right. But I think I'm sorry, I'm not able to really give you a very sort of a knockdown sort of explanation on this. But there's a lot of literature on this, and there are sort of different accounts of majoritarianism. What kind of majoritarianism are you talking about? That's again a huge issue. Yes, but that's interesting.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Since we are running over time, we'll be closing the Q&A now. If there are any more questions or follow-ups, kindly write an email to Professor. His email ID will be shared in the chat box now. Thank you so much, Professor, for engaging in the Q&A session. Over to you, Diksha.
Yeah, so now I invite Aditi to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Diksha. On behalf of the school, I thank you, Professor, for such a thought-provoking talk. The insights we received today will help us in not just our philosophy research, but also in our lives. A warm thanks to Professor Koshi. Thank you, sir, for always supporting and encouraging us in all our shenanigans. I thank all the faculty members of the school for their unwavering support. Thank you to all the participants from outside and inside the Goa University. And last but not the least, my gratitude towards all the research scholars. A special mention to all those helped organize, publicize the talk, designing the poster, and making the talk a success. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Tharakan. Thank you, Sia.
Thank you.
and team. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Bhaskarjit. It was wonderful listening to him. So also very glad to see Dr. Mohammad Ali, my senior from HCU.
Thank you, Professor Mohammed.
Yeah, welcome, Ali. Yes. Both of you have something also in common in IIT Kanpur. Dr. Ali was also in IIT Kanpur for some time.
I know. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope to catch you up the next
Yeah,
time.
thank you all. Before we leave, I would like to announce that the lecture recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, Philosophy at Goa University. We'll be back soon with another insightful guest lecture next month. Thank you for joining us today. Take care and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.